in response to the question, I think Britain has a problem in seeming hypocritical in that, as a democracy, before they invaded Iraq, over 1 million people, Muslim and non-Muslim, and to a degree the first time British people came out in force together about an issue in an Arab or Muslim country. And so the Muslims felt, actually, it's not just us now speaking, but we have a majority as well, or a large portion of the population agreeing with us. So we're out here, and they were ignored. And so that shows democracy not working. It was democracy in action by simply the fact that they could go out onto the streets and protest, but they were ignored. And I think that ultimately, because they talk now about terror, well, their invasion of Iraq is seen as a terrorist act, and the fact that they haven't taken care of the aftermath as well as they perhaps could or should. So ultimately, I think the Muslim population, or at least a certain segment, sees the British government as terrorists, and that they haven't acknowledged their failures, and therefore there's a hypocrisy, and engaging in a democratic sense is going to be very difficult until there is an acceptance of, if not guilt, at least flaw.
Okay.
What I want to see in our society is a diverse society, a society where integration is about diversity and linked by bonds of citizenship. But my very deep concern is that the terrorist threat, which I see as a global threat, is in fact threatening that concept. And I think that in the UK, I think that many people in the UK have been very slow to recognise the nature of the terrorist threat against citizens of the UK, and those citizens are of all religions, of all ethnicities, and none. And a threat based on an ideology which looks at non-believers, however the people concerned define those as infidels, and wishes to destroy. And I think that's an entirely new concept for UK democracy, and indeed Western democracies, to have to cope with. And I think that that now is being faced. It has led to security actions, which I think are necessary, which certainly do sometimes have an aftermath of people feeling that they are threatened and they are vulnerable. But I think it is important to recognise that threat is against all citizens, not just one group of citizens. So I certainly don't buy into the argument that this is something against Muslims. I don't think that is true. And I think the people perpetuating the problem are a relatively very small group of people, but highly motivated and working globally. And I think that's the nature of the challenge to us as a democracy.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Imran Ahmad. I'm a writer, the author of Unimagined, A Muslim Boy Meets the West, which has just been published, and it deals in a light-hearted way with problems and tensions of growing up in the West as a Muslim. I'm also a trustee of British Muslims for Secular Democracy, which is an organisation that seeks to ensure that everyone participates equally in a democratic process, in essentially a secular democratic process, not one in which anyone feels bullied by any particular theological perspective. Now, to answer your question, it's a very complex issue, and I think unfortunately that the core of the problem is that the democratic society is not actually geared up to deal with the nature of this terrorist threat, and so it sort of takes us by surprise to a large extent. And we need to have an immediate tactical response and a strategic response. The tactical response is purely and simply to prevent any further terrorist atrocity. In so doing, that tactical response can seem unpleasant to some people, can seem heavy-handed, but I feel that if there is a threat, then there is no option, there is no choice. And in fact, the very worst thing that could happen for any community in this country, but particularly the Muslim community, the very worst thing that could happen for the Muslim community in this country is another terrorist action like 7/7. So that being the case, if some Muslims have to be inconvenienced at 4 o'clock in the morning because of some intelligence that has been presented to the security services, I don't feel that that is too great a price to pay if it prevents a terrorist event. It is an unfortunate necessity. The fact that some people are often released without charge is in fact our indication that the process is working in some way, that evidence isn't simply fabricated, people aren't simply convicted based on false evidence and so on. So that's the tactical response. I don't see any choice, there's no choice there. Then there's a strategic response, which is far more complicated and will take much greater time. The strategic response is multifaceted, has education and communication at its core, and has to work against those sinister groups who really seek to take a number of disparate situations around the world and convince a sector of the population that all of these disparate situations, whether it be Iraq, for whatever reason we went into Iraq, Bosnia, Chechnya and so on, that all of these disparate situations actually represent a concerted war on Islam by something known as the West, a singular collective entity known as the West, which of course is not a reality, because the West is as disparate as any other cultural group in the world. But they seek this polarization because it serves their ends. And to counter that is a very long strategic process.
Okay.
Oh.
Hi, my name is Alan Johnson. I'm the editor of Democratia.com, an online political review and journal. I'm also a supporter of Labour Friends of Iraq and a co-author of the Euston Manifesto. I agree with much of what Imran just said. I think what we need is what I would call a combative democracy. And I think that we don't have one yet, and we've been pretty slow to create one, and we need to get a move on. I think we've failed to face up to the challenge in a number of ways. I think we've been very slow to appreciate the scale and the lethality of the problem, of the threat. There's much denial, there's much wishful thinking. I think we've failed to separate out those who are part of the solution, moderate, progressive Democrats, both here and internationally. We failed to support those groups properly, and almost bizarrely, we seem what we do instead is to succor and promote and support some of those groups who I think are actually part of the problem. Now, whether this is the Foreign Commonwealth Office chasing after the Muslim Brotherhood, whether it's Ken Livingstone welcoming very reactionary clerics, even if you take the left of the Labour Party, whether it's the Compass Conference deciding it's going to invite the Muslim Association of Britain to its 2007 event, or the Guardian promoting Islamists through its comment pages. In all sorts of ways, we don't seem yet that we have the kind of intellectual culture which is willing to stand up and draw lines and to carry the battle of ideas to the problem. I don't think we've faced up to the ideological nature of the threat. I don't think fundamentally we're facing blowback against imperialism, fundamentally. I don't think we're facing a spasm of rage against economic deprivation. I think we're facing a mass movement, come ideology, come pathology, comparable in some ways to communism and fascism, and it's going to take that kind of a fight, a long battle for hearts and minds, a long kind of a cold war, if you like, against extremism. And I think we need that third force, we need that battle of ideas, and that's what I mean by a combative democracy. Certainly one that will take the kind of security responses we need, but possibly more importantly, one that's equipped with a sense of identity in our own democratic values, and pride in those, and a willingness to fight for them, because that's what we're now engaged in a battle to do.